Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the former Foreign Secretary, William Hague, has caused a stir in Westminster today by suggesting we should look at legalising cannabis. Writing in the Daily Telegraph, former Conservative Party leader Lord Hague said the war on cannabis had been comprehensively and irreversibly lost. He wrote encouraging the Prime Minister to introduce a bold major change in policy and said that the idea that cannabis can be driven off the streets and out of people's lives by the state is nothing short of deluded. Well, here to discuss the merits or lack thereof of legalising cannabis are the Mail on Sunday's Peter Hitchens and Green Party co-leader Caroline Lucas. Welcome to both of you. Peter Hitchens, is William Hague right?
No, his arguments are pathetic, factually miserable, logically futile and morally reprehensible. And it's a disgrace to frontline politics that anybody in such a position should be embracing such a campaign. And a pitiful sight to see what looks to me like a plan by the Conservative Party to get down with the kids and become the party of the spliff.
Is that how you see it, Caroline?
I don't see it that way at all. I do agree with what William Hague said, but I have to say that strategically, I don't think it was very sensible to bring together what are, in fact, two separate issues. One issue is around medicinal cannabis. The other issue is around the broader issue around drugs reform. And on medicinal cannabis, there is absolutely no excuse for the government not licensing it right now. Anyone who has heard Hannah Deacon, who has heard any of the parents of those young children who are suffering so much, the idea that Sajid Javid should somehow be some kind of royal pharmacist in chief deciding who should get drugs and who shouldn't is preposterous. And the government needs to act now.
Right, and we're going to discuss that in a little more detail. But obviously, we'll take your comments on board, but particularly about the parents who have had to suffer with this as they see it. And there is going to be a statement, actually, this afternoon from Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary. To return to the broader discussion, though, that you say is pitiful politically and in terms of facts, why is William Hague wrong when he says the idea that this can be driven off the streets and out of people's lives by the state is nothing short of deluded? I mean, it's true. No one has succeeded in driving it off the streets.
Well, actually, that's false. The Japanese and the South Koreans make a very good job of driving it off the streets by simply enforcing laws against possession, which we have on our statute books, but have deliberately not enforced, since the Lord Chancellor, the former Lord Hailsham, told magistrates to stop sending people to prison for cannabis possession in 1973. And there's been a 40-year period of non-enforcement under which the establishment of the government have connived at the spread of cannabis in this country. To say that the war on drugs has failed is like saying our settlement on Mars has failed. We have no war on drugs. There's been no settlement on Mars either. It's a ludicrous statement, and anybody who makes it is immediately exposing himself as either brainwashed or completely indifferent to facts.
Well, is that you, Caroline Lucas? Are you brainwashed
remotely resembling
in that sense?
I am not brainwashed, and I would be fascinated to know how many more prisons Peter would love us to build, how many more police he would like to have diverted away from more serious crimes, trying to crack down on the 6.5% of British people who say that they use cannabis regularly. I imagine the percentage is actually more if it's 6.5% actually saying that. But the bottom line is this. I want to reduce the harm associated with drugs, and I think the evidence demonstrates that if you were to regulate cannabis rather than having the free-for-all whereby 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 14-year-olds can get hold of it much more easily than they can get hold of alcohol, we need to look at that again and think, where is the sense in this debate?
And this is about harm that's caused. You may disagree with the whole approach, Peter Hitchens, and you may say that there isn't really a real war against drugs. But if you look at the reality in terms of the harm that is done to people, has Caroline Lucas and people who agree with her got a point that in order to reduce the harm being done by very strong strains of cannabis, you'd be much better off regulating it, knowing what was out on the streets, and in that sense, fewer people would be hurt?
Regulation is a dishonest euphemism for legalisation.
No, it's not.
Well, let me finish. Here's what tobacco is regulated, cigarettes are regulated. Are they safe? Of course they're not. Alcohol is regulated. Is it safe? No, it isn't. Does nobody buy any alcohol except in minor strengths? The opposite is the case. The strengths of almost all alcoholic drinks have been rising under market pressure in this country in the past 30 years, as any observant person knows. And high-strength cannabis is widely sold because that's what people who smoke cannabis want to smoke.
That's certainly not true.
Oh, no.
And I think I might know more about it.
What is
I'm
not going to argue about that.
Well, good, because I think you'll find that the evidence suggests that actually many people will be much happier to know that they were using a lower strength form of cannabis. The point is that when you've got it in the hands of gangs rather than governments, it's in the interests of those gangs to be selling the strongest possible because it's more expensive. If you were to regulate it, that wouldn't be the case. But my challenge to Peter Hitchens is this: why don't we actually have an assessment? Why don't we have a pilot on this? Why don't we look at the evidence and see what happens? If he's right, which I don't for a moment believe that he is, but if he is, if it suddenly leads to this free-for-all, then OK, we can stop. But I think at the very least we should recognise that our Misuse of Drugs Act is nearly 50 years old. Things have changed since then. Let's try it, let's look at the evidence and then make the decision.
Peter?
We've been having an experiment for the past 40-odd years, ever since...
Not an experiment in the way Caroline has articulated it.
But we've been having an experiment in decriminalisation of cannabis, and you just go ask around any psychiatric hospital and ask them what they think is one of the major causes of mental illness in this country.
But that's because it's unregulated and therefore...
Because it's not regulated, it's because we've given up enforcing our laws against its possession, and we simply don't do it. To say that because we've given up laws against enforcing possession and it's led to a mess, that we should now get rid of those laws entirely, which would be a first step towards advertising general sale on the high street and on the internet, and the disaster that would follow that. It's shameful.
All right, Damien Green,
anybody in a position of responsibility in this society to advocate this, that you will be so ashamed of yourself 20 or 30 years hence when the levels of mental illness reach the level.
All right, well, let's ask.
What has happened, Peter? Why has that not happened in the countries that have already gone down this road? You come on here and you spout all of these myths, and it's not true.
This country has the most long-standing and advanced, if you care to call it that, experiment in legalising cannabis in the world.
All right, well, let's ask someone who has worked in the Home Office. I mean, Damien Green, is that true? Is that what the government now needs to look at? Does it need to review this whole issue of whether it should be decriminalised broadly?
I think there's a case for something like a Royal Commission. I think Peter made the interesting comparison with tobacco and alcohol. And, of course, the obvious, if you like, example on the side of liberalisation is prohibition of alcohol in America, where you took a drug that was widely available, made it illegal, and actually you just handed it into... you created criminality.
Can I just make a small point? You've used the word prohibition. One of the principal aspects of prohibition of alcohol in the United States was that possession of alcohol was not banned.
Yes,
which is exactly the position we have here with cannabis.
It's not quite...
You're saying it failed. Sure, it failed, just as our efforts are failing, because possession...
What I was going on to say, if I can finish, Peter...
you can always finish.
...was that the point being that have we reached a point in this country where for large numbers of people they sort of just disregard the law, the fact that cannabis is illegal? And are you ever going to turn that around? I mean, Peter wants to turn it around by cracking down. Others would argue that actually, you know what, particularly anyone under the age of 25 will just think it's slightly weird. It's actually more difficult for teenagers to buy alcohol than cannabis in Britain today.
Right,
now,
so you would like to see it...
So we may reach a tipping point. I'm not sure, and I actually would like some decent investigation and some decent evidence of this. I think, because what I don't like, obviously cannabis does harm, it's a dangerous drug, all of that. There is a harm on the other side where people just completely disregard the law. And if large sections of the population disregard the law, that in itself is a harm to society.
Isn't that the problem? That it is no longer a disincentive, that there are such large numbers of people smoking cannabis of various strains, that the law hasn't worked. You're calling for it to be much, much tougher, but there will still be people who will flout that law. So isn't it time to look at it differently?
I'm accused of wanting crackdowns and being much, much tougher. I'm saying the law of this country on the statute books passed by Parliament should be applied by the police and the courts. And it is perfectly obvious that in the initial period of any enforcement of the law, you have to be pretty stringent about it. That's how we achieved a very successful action against drunken driving in the 1960s.
Right.
In a matter of months, because we enforced the law, the number of people prepared to take that stupid risk diminished.
Right.
You could do exactly the same with...
What about the message?
But
what about the message?
That's why you don't like it.
All right, well, let's look at the comparison. But also, is there a general message that is dangerous to say it's all right to smoke drugs?
I don't want to say it's all right to smoke drugs. What I want to do is to look at the evidence that reduces the harm that comes with smoking drugs. And you've just said that as a 13 or 14-year-old, it is much easier to get hold of drugs than it is to get hold of alcohol.
Is that true?
So yes, I can tell you from my own kids, 2 boys, and I can absolutely tell you that.
It's easier to buy in a shop.
No.
Well, there is strong evidence, Peter Hitchens, that it is certainly as easy.
It's not difficult for the young to
let Caroline finish.
To my challenge to Peter, I don't see why he's so scared of the evidence, except that he might find that it actually disproves what he's saying. Why don't we have an impact assessment of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act? There aren't many rules on our statute book that have been there for 50 years without having been looked at again. Those of us who think that it's not working, I think, would be the ones who will be demonstrated to be right. And as a result, we could then have an evidence-based approach to this issue that would reduce harm.
Hang on, Peter, is the problem here, the Prime Minister is implacably opposed, we know that, to any idea of legalising or decriminalising cannabis for recreational use. Should she rethink her position?
Well, I think everyone should look at the evidence. And at the moment, I rather agree with Caroline. It's maybe a first, but Caroline, I agree on this. That let's actually look at the evidence, because things have changed over the past 3 decades. Some for the worse. Peter is absolutely right that skunk is now widely available, which is much more damaging than sort of ageing hippies from the 1960s remember what they did in their youth. So that's one side of the argument. The other side is the widespread neglect of the law, which I also regard as a harm. Let's actually have a decent commission to look at the arguments.
Thank you both for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, the debate over legalisation follows increasing pressure on the government to look at allowing cannabis oil for medical use. Yesterday, a boy suffering from severe epilepsy was discharged from hospital after he'd been granted a 20-day licence to use the oil to help treat his condition. Billy Caldwell's mother has called for the drug to be made more widely available and said every child and every single family affected should have immediate access to the very same medication. Yesterday, Home Office Minister Nick Hurd said the government would look at the issue.
However, this case and that of Alfie Dingley and others has shone a light on the use of cannabis medicine in this country and highlighted the need for the government to explore the issue further and our handling of these issues further. I recognise the need to ensure that the approach to licensing works more effectively. As a first step, I can announce today, Mr. Speaker, that the government is establishing an expert panel of clinicians to advise ministers on any individual applications to prescribe cannabis-based medicines. This is consistent with the principle that a clinician must be at the heart of the process.
Minister Nick Hurd in the Commons. Well, here in the studio is Hannah Deacon, whose son also suffers from epilepsy and is pressurising the government to grant her a licence to use cannabis oil, and Labour frontbencher Andy MacDonald, whose son died from intractable epilepsy. Welcome to both of you. Hannah, first of all, how are you managing your son's condition at the moment?
Well, at the moment he is improved. Before we went to Holland, he was having clusters of seizures every week, which required intravenous steroids and emergency care every week. Now we are paying for him to be on CBD oil, which is a recognised legal cannabinoid in this country, just to try and keep the wolf from the door. But he is still having seizures, and every seizure is life-threatening that he has. But he is a little better than he was. What we need is the compound THC, which is the whole complement of medication that he was prescribed in Holland to keep his seizures at bay.
Now, you've met the Prime Minister and talked to her about this. What did she promise you when you met in March?
I met her on the 20th of March when we presented our petition, which now actually has 700,000 people that have signed it. And she spoke to me along with her ministers and our MP, and she said she met my children, and it was, a nice occasion. And she said to me that they would find a way legally to create a licensing application so Alfie could have his medication that he was prescribed in Holland. I felt in my heart that she really wanted him to have it. She looked me in the eye and she said, we will do this sympathetically, we will do this compassionately, we will do this speedily, so we can keep our boy well. And it's been 3 months and we've gone through a horrible, arduous process that actually a pharmaceutical company should go through to apply for a licence. There's 3 applications, £4,000 each. There's lots and lots of changes constantly happening. I really feel like they weren't really sure what process to put us through. And it hasn't been compassionate and it hasn't been speedy, and we're calling upon her to act and do what she said she would do.
Because the law, as it currently stands, is hurting your son.
Yeah, and it's hurting not just him, but me, my husband, my daughter, our family. It's horrendous what we've had to go through for the last few years, and we need some compassion and understanding for people who are in our position, who have children who are very, very ill.
Does Theresa May need to act on this right now? I mean, as Hannah was saying, the Prime Minister looked her in the eye and said, we will do something about this.
I mean, I think clearly the announcement yesterday about this panel, I hope this means that Hannah's case and all the similar ones can now be dealt with this panel really quickly. That seems to me to be a sort of temporary measure to make sure that those who are already suffering in this way can get the relevant licences, so you can have access to the medicine.
But should the blanket ban be removed now?
Well, I think, as I say, I think that panel is a temporary move to looking at a proper legal situation where you can have, if this medicine is medically approved, then obviously it should be available to people.
I mean, listening to this, I mean, you had the tragic loss of your own son as a result of epilepsy. You must feel an awful lot of sympathy for Hannah in the situation that she is now.
Well, absolutely. I recognise the things that Hannah's telling us about, and to put parents in that position of having to battle and go through this process, it's really arduous, it's extremely difficult, and what parents want is help and compassion and urgent action. And we know that this is efficacious, we know that this works. You have your clinical advice there and then with your paediatricians and your neurologist. You've got the authority, do it. That's the humane thing to do. Not to set up yet another panel. If a family's been waiting 3 months for the go-ahead, I cannot begin to describe to you the torment and that they're going through, and the torture they're going through of trying to keep their son well, and every night fearing that they may find him dead. I can't begin to describe you the burden that puts upon families, and I would want any family in Hannah's circumstances or otherwise to avoid the trauma that we went through. It can be done. The remedy is there. The government should embrace it and get on with it right now.
As I understand it, there are, and clearly others will be much more expert than me in this, there is an application that can be made that enables you to get access
Well,
to
that's
it.
the point.
That's what we've done, sorry.
Yeah. No, but why are we asking parents to go through yet another process? This is difficult enough to deal with health, with DWP, with all the rest of the agencies that parents in these circumstances have to deal with. And it is the brave and the articulate and the forceful who can plough their way through this. There are plenty of other people in Hannah's position across the United Kingdom who are not able to do that, and they have to suffer that burden and that threat and that pain of that happening to them and their family. It really shouldn't be fill out another form and go through another process. The state and the authorities should be there to intervene and assist and put this right now. It isn't a question of waiting a week or a month. It's got to be resolved immediately, and the government has the ability to do it, and it should.
Sure, I get this. I assume that the panel, which is being run by the Chief Medical Officer, will be able to drive this through.
But Damien, you don't need
Well,
a panel when you've got medics, you've got paediatricians and neurologists there saying this is efficacious, do it.
Well, if it can be done, is the problem is it just takes too long?
That's a new thing that was announced yesterday.
Yeah.
Our situation is separate from that in the sense that when we met the Prime Minister, she allowed us to put in a compassionate licence application. We were told it'd be compassionate. We've got 6 clinicians together who are saying Alfie needs this treatment. We have gone through what is a pharmaceutical application. So much bureaucracy, so much hoop jumping. As you say, most families wouldn't be able to do that, and they actually wouldn't find the doctors that would support them. We were lucky that we've got brave doctors who say Alfie's needs come first. They're not worried about anything else. They want Alfie to be safe. We have been put through this ridiculous process. It was we met with them in February. They had February. They should have thought about what process to put us through, and we haven't. And now I want my son's licence.
Right, should the law be changed right now?
Well, I think that clearly the licence should be granted right now. If you've been waiting months, that's clearly wrong. And if other parents...
But why is there a bureaucratic process for medicinal use of cannabis oil that can save children's lives?
Well, I hope that, I mean, all of this is, clearly very strong evidence. The Chief Medical Officer is now in charge of this can act on it and just say that if a clinician says this medicine is suitable for this child, then yes, it should be given the way
But is
medicines
politics
are.
now and holding this up? I mean, politics is getting in the way, and the bureaucratic processes that are involved of Hannah and others doing something to keep their children safe.
It seems to be the case, and yet across Parliament there would be overwhelming support for a positive and urgent response. Now, I understand Sajid Javid raised the issue at Cabinet and wasn't allowed the time and it wasn't on the agenda. You know, that really isn't good enough. Just quickly deal with this. There's an urgent need and the government can respond. It will get support across the House. We can do this. Let's do it.
All the opposition parties are in favour of it. Could Theresa May do something right now?
Well, I think...
Could she? Could she do something now? Should she?
I mean, yeah, governments can do some things. I think the problem, it sounds to me as though, I mean, you say it's a political problem. It sounds like it's a more bureaucratic problem of the sort of...
But Theresa May promised Hannah face to face that she would deal with this. She
My
could.
son is 6 years old with severe epilepsy. He's not a political football. He is a little boy who needs help, and I was promised help sincerely, and I feel like I've been played. Have I been played, or should I have accepted that as a sincere offer?
I'm sure nobody within the system wants to play anyone in your family's situation. So, and absolutely, I think there's no. Absolutely no politician of any party would be thinking, yeah, let's play politics with this. I think this feels to me like sort of the bureauccy grinding too slowly.
Right.
And it needs to go faster.
Through that. Yeah. And if you're the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, you can say, you can use your muscle and use your power and say, I want this to happen. I want it to happen today. And it should. There's no reason why it should not. Remove the ban. If a clinician says it's efficacious and it's appropriate for this instance, get on with it. This won't do to hide it behind some sort of process. Blast through the process, get rid of it.
Andy, would cannabis oil have been something that might have been used effectively for your son? I know, I mean, you'll never know in that sense, but do you think it might have been?
It may well have been. I would love to have had the opportunity to try it.
When you sit here next to Andy, who passionately believes, like many other politicians, that this should happen, does it restore your faith that something will change that will help your family?
I hope so. I hope that the Prime Minister will keep her promise to me and my family. What I would say is that there is cross-party support for medical cannabis legislation. We have had the most amazing support from wonderful people involved in our campaign. I have faith in all of those people. I just think that this is bureaucracy gone mad. This is not dealing with me as a mother of a child who's ill, as a mother who has been in hospital every week with my child for 2 years, watching him and hoping he won't die. I have found a medication which is regulated in Holland under a GMP, you know, it's a company that makes a pharmaceutical grade oil with a GMP certification, you know, and it's clinician led. This is enough, surely.
Well, thank you both for coming in. Very difficult for both of you, I understand that.
I've been